There are moments in a person's life that function as a kind of before and after. Not the dramatic ones you anticipate, not the graduations, the weddings, the births, the losses you see coming from a distance and brace yourself against. The ones that actually split your life in half are quieter than that. They arrive in the middle of ordinary Tuesday afternoons, or at the tail end of a phone call you thought was going to be routine, or in the specific silence that follows a sentence you didn't expect and can't unhear. They arrive without warning and without ceremony. And afterward, everything, every memory, every assumption, every relationship you thought you understood has to be re-examined in their light. My before and after arrived on a Sunday evening in September, 6 hours after my wedding reception ended, when my father called my cell phone and told me that as of that moment, he was removing me from his life. Not his will, though that came later, not his company, not his social circle, or his legacy, or the elaborate infrastructure of wealth and influence he had spent 30 years constructing. He removed me from his life, his actual daily personal life, the part where I was his son and he was my father. And that meant something beyond assets and appearances and the careful choreography of a powerful man's public image. He did it in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I know because I looked at the call log afterward, the way you look at evidence after something has happened that you need to make real and concrete because your mind keeps trying to tell you it didn't. This is the story of those 4 minutes, of the 6 months that followed, and of the phone call he made to me at the end of them that told me everything. I had spent my entire life trying to figure out about who my father actually was. I need to start where it starts, which is not at the wedding. The wedding was just the place where everything that had been building for 31 years finally broke the surface. To understand the wedding, you need to understand my father. And to understand my father, you need to understand what it meant to grow up as the son of a man who had built everything. From nothing and never, not once in his life, forgiven anyone for witnessing the nothing. My father, Richard, he went by Richard, never Rick, never Dad in public, always Richard, had grown up poor in a way that marked him permanently. Not poor in the romanticized, we were broke but we had love, way that people sometimes describe in retrospect with a warm glow. Poor in the hard, specific, humiliating way that leaves a person with a lifelong horror of being perceived as less than. He had built his company from a single contract and 2 employees in his late 20s. And by the time I was born, he was already successful. And by the time I was 10, he was wealthy. And by the time I was 20, he was the kind of man whose name appeared in the business section of newspapers and who received invitations to things that other people only read about. The money had not made him generous. This is the thing people always get wrong about self-made wealthy men. They assume that the arrival of abundance produces abundance in the person. Sometimes it does. In my father, it produced the opposite. It produced a man who was exquisitely, exhaustingly attuned to the appearance of control, who needed every variable in his life to reflect well on him, who treated his family, his wife, my mother, who was gracious and gentle and managed her marriage the way a diplomat manages a volatile alliance, and me, his only child, as extensions of his brand, rather than as people with their own interiority and their own choices and their own right to build lives that didn't require his approval as a foundation. I spent my childhood performing for an audience of one. Every grade, every achievement, every social connection was filtered through the question of what it would mean to Richard. Not whether it was good for me, not whether it made me happy or healthy or whole, whether it reflected appropriately on him and on the image of the family he was so relentlessly constructing. I was acceptable when I was excellent. I was invisible when I was merely good. I learned early that love in our house was not unconditional. It was a performance review, and the metrics were always his. I did well by his standards for a long time. I went to the right school. I studied the right things. I came into the company at 23 and worked genuinely hard and learned genuinely fast, and by 28, I was a senior vice president, which meant something real in terms of capability and meant something entirely different in terms of what my father communicated about it publicly, which was that his son was exceptional, which was true. But what he meant was that his son was a reflection of him, which was the only kind of exceptional that mattered in Richard's world. Then I met Simone. Simone was a public school teacher, 3rd grade. She drove a 7-year-old car that had a crack in the dashboard she'd fixed with electrical tape, and she cared about that car with the same cheerful practicality she brought to everything. She was not precious about things, was Simone. She was precise and warm and funny in a way that ambushed you, the kind of funny that arrives before you realize something was a joke and catches you genuinely unprepared. She had grown up in a middle-class family in a mid-sized city 4 hours from where I'd grown up, and her parents were kind and present in the effortless, unperformative way that told you their love had never been conditional on anything. I knew the first time I brought her home that my father was going to be a problem. He was polite. Richard was always polite. Politeness was one of the tools in his image management kit, deployed precisely when needed and retracted the moment the social performance no longer required it. He shook her hand. He asked her appropriate questions. He was pleasant through dinner, in the way that a man is pleasant when he has already decided something and is simply biding time before acting on it. After Simone had gone to bed, he sat down with me in his study, that room that had always functioned as the seat of his authority, where every significant conversation of my childhood had been conducted across his mahogany desk, and he told me, with the measured calm of a man accustomed to delivering assessments, that Simone was not the right choice for me. He didn't say she wasn't good enough. Richard was too intelligent to be that crude. What he said was that she didn't fit the trajectory, that the life I was building, his word, his framing, as though my life were a strategic plan he had authored, required a partner who understood a certain world, who moved in it naturally, who could stand beside me at the events and the meetings and the dinners that would define the next 20 years. A teacher, he said, with a careful neutrality that was more dismissive than any adjective he could have chosen, would find that world difficult to navigate. I sat across that desk and I felt something I had felt many times in that room, the familiar compression of my own perspective under the weight of his certainty, the way he could make you feel that disagreeing with him wasn't just incorrect, but somehow naive, as though he had access to information about reality that you simply didn't yet possess. I had spent 31 years managing that feeling, accommodating it, routing around it. I told him I understood his perspective. I drove home. I proposed to Simone 3 weeks later on a Tuesday evening in her kitchen, which smelled like the soup she was making. And she said yes immediately, and then went back to stirring the soup, which struck me as the most perfectly Simone response available, and I sat at her kitchen counter and felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely certain. The engagement period was a Cold War. My father was present in the required ways. He came to the engagement dinner. He contributed to the wedding costs in the precise amount that allowed him to maintain the appearance of support without actually providing it. He shook hands at the rehearsal with the careful smile of a man performing family for an audience. My mother was genuinely warm and told me privately that she loved Simone, which I believed, and that she hoped Richard would come around, which I no longer believed by that point, but appreciated her saying. The wedding was beautiful. I want you to know that. Whatever happened after it, the wedding itself was everything it should have been. Simone in the dress she had found and altered herself, laughing with her father before they walked, my hand holding hers during the vows with a steadiness I felt all the way through me. The reception was full of people who loved us without agenda. My father gave a toast that was technically gracious and emotionally vacant, and I watched Simone's mother tear up during it because she was hearing love even though I knew, from long experience, that the words were performance. He called at 11:47 p.m. I had just gotten to the hotel. Simone was in the bathroom. I answered because it was my father, and old habits are the deepest habits. He told me that he was disappointed, that what I had done, marrying Simone, choosing that life, refusing to honor the trajectory he had envisioned, was a rejection of everything he had built and sacrificed. He used the word sacrifice. He told me that he had decided, effective immediately, to remove me from any operational role at the company, that my access would be revoked by Monday morning, that he would not be providing the annual financial support he had given me since I'd joined the company, a significant amount, separate from my salary, that he had always framed as investment in our shared future, and that he needed, for his own reasons, distance. He said all of this in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He said it without raising his voice. He said it in the measured, decisive tone of a man who had made a business decision and was communicating it clearly. And then he said goodnight and he ended the call. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time. Simone came out of the bathroom and saw my face and sat down next to me without asking anything. Just sat next to me in her wedding dress and let me be in whatever I was in until I was ready to come back. That's who she was. That is who she is. She didn't ask me to explain or perform or manage it. She just stayed. I told her everything. Not just that night, but in the days after. Everything. The years of performance, the desk in the study, the trajectory he'd built in his mind and placed me inside of without asking. She listened in the way she listened to everything, fully, without interrupting, without layering her own response over the top of what I was saying. And when I was done, she said, "What do you want to do?" Not what do we do, not what should you do. What do you want to do? She had given the question back to me like a gift. And I held it, and I found that I actually knew the answer. I wanted to build something that was mine, not his, not the trajectory, mine. The 6 months that followed were the hardest and most clarifying of my life. I left the company, not because he'd revoked my access, but because staying, even if I could have negotiated my way back in, would have meant returning to a room where my value was defined by his assessment of it. And I was done living in that room. I took nothing from him, and I asked for nothing. I had savings. I had, it turned out, a genuine set of skills that had been developed inside his company but were entirely my own. I started consulting. Small clients first, then larger ones, working in the operational strategy space I'd spent 6 years in at his company. Simone kept teaching. We lived on less than I had ever lived on, and it was genuinely fine, more than fine, because the money we spent was ours in a way that money had never felt before. Simone's kitchen table became my office. Her practicality became my curriculum. I watched the way she moved through the world without performance, without the exhausting management of appearances, with a directness and a warmth that made people trust her immediately. And I understood, more clearly than I ever had, exactly what my father had been trying to take from me when he told me she didn't fit the trajectory. She was the trajectory. She had always been the trajectory, the correct one. My mother called every 2 weeks carefully, threading the needle between her love for me and her marriage to him. I never asked her to choose, and she never made me ask. She told me things, in the oblique way that people tell, things they can't say, directly, that my father was quieter than usual, that he had attended a dinner with some of our family friends, and that my name had come up, and he had not responded the way she expected, that something was shifting in him that she couldn't fully name. The call came on a Thursday morning in April, 6 months and 11 days after the wedding. I was at the kitchen table, working on a proposal for a client, coffee going cold at my elbow, his name on my phone screen. I looked at it for a long time before I answered. He sounded different. There is no clean way to describe it except that the architecture of his voice had changed. The precise, managed, boardroom quality that had defined every conversation of my entire life was still there, but underneath, there was something else. Something that cost him. I could hear it costing him in real time. The way you can hear effort in someone's breathing when they're carrying something heavy. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He asked about Simone. I told him she was well. And then there was a silence that was not his usual silence, not the strategic pause of a man who chooses when to speak because he controls the room, but the silence of someone standing at an edge they have never stood at before, looking at the drop. He said, "I've been wrong about some things, about a great many things if I'm being honest, and I'm not accustomed to that, which is perhaps itself part of the problem." I said nothing. I had learned from Simone the value of letting silence do its work. He said, "What I did on your wedding night was not the action of a good father. I have known that for some time. I'm telling you now because I've discovered that knowing something and doing nothing about it is its own kind of dishonesty, and I've had enough of that particular dishonesty." He paused, and then he said, "I would like to know my son, if that remains possible. I want to be honest with you about what happened inside me in that moment, because I think it matters. It was not triumph. If you're waiting for triumph, for the clean, satisfaction of a vindicated person receiving the apology they're owed, I have to tell you that's not what it felt like. What it felt like was grief. Actually, the grief for the 31 years of a relationship that had been conducted in the wrong register, in the language of performance and expectation rather than the language of actual love. Grief for the version of a father and son relationship I had quietly wanted my whole life without ever believing I would have access to it. And underneath the grief, something else. Something that recognized, with the specific clarity that only comes from having built something genuinely yours, that I was now in a different position than I had ever been in with him. Not a better person. I don't think the 6 months made me better exactly. More myself. And a person who is fully themselves cannot be managed the way a person who needs approval can be managed. The leverage was gone. The dynamic was gone. What was left, if we were going to build anything from here, was going to have to be real. I told him that it was possible. I told him that Simone would need to be respected. Not performed at. Not tolerated, but genuinely respected as my partner and as a person. I told him that I would not be returning to the company, not because I was punishing him, but because I was building something of my own and it mattered to me to see it through. I told him that I loved him, which was true and complicated and had always been true and complicated, and that I wanted to know him too, the real version, not the Richard who managed everything, but the man underneath who had grown up poor and afraid and had spent decades trying to make sure no one could ever see that in him again. There was a very long silence, and then he said, "I don't know if I know how to be that person." I said, "I know. We can figure it out. We are figuring it out, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that real things are always built, with setbacks and with patience and with the willingness to show up again after the setbacks and try a different way." He has had dinner in our home 4 times since that call. He is awkward with Simone, in the way of a man who knows he owes an apology he hasn't yet fully delivered, and she is gracious with him in the way of a woman who understands that people are more than their worst moments. My mother exhales differently at family gatherings now. Something that had been held tight for decades is slowly, carefully releasing. My company, the consulting practice, I built from Simone's kitchen table, has 15 clients and a partner. I brought on last year who was sharper than me in the ways I needed someone sharper. My father asked me about it at one of those dinners. He asked real questions, curious ones, questions without embedded assessments. I answered them. Afterward, I sat in the car with Simone, and she looked at me and said, "How was that?" And I thought about it honestly and said, "It was good. It was actually good." Here is what I want to leave with you. A parent's approval is not a prerequisite for your own life. Their vision of your trajectory is not your trajectory. The love that comes with conditions attached is still love. It is just love that hasn't learned how to be free yet. And you do not have to wait for it to become free before you begin. You begin anyway. You build anyway. You choose the person who sits with you at the edge of the hotel bed without asking you to explain yourself. And you build a life that is genuinely, completely, irreversibly yours. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person who tried to stop, you will eventually stand in the wreckage of their own certainty and find their way to your door. And what you do then is up to you. It is entirely, finally, completely up to you. If you have ever built something, a life, a relationship, a version of yourself, in direct defiance of someone who told you that you couldn't, I want you to leave one word in the comments. Meridian. Just that. You'll know what it means, and so will I. Subscribe because the stories in this community are the ones that don't get told loudly enough. Turn on notifications, because what's coming next will reach into the part of you that has been waiting, quietly, for someone to say the thing you already knew. I'll see you there.